Imagine sitting in the quiet of your living room. The greatest conflict in human history has been over for years. The nation has moved on, building suburbs and celebrating peace. But every year, without fail, as late November approaches and the holiday season begins, the letters arrive. They are slipped into your mailbox, carrying no return address, only words heavy with an unbearable grief. You open one, and the ink on the page reads, "Why did you live while my boy rests forever at the bottom of the Pacific?" For more than 20 years, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III received these letters. He kept them, he read them, and he carried their immense weight in absolute silence until it became too much for one man to bear. The story of the USS Indianapolis is widely known as the most devastating loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy. We know the terrifying numbers. 1,195 men went into the water, and only 316 were pulled from it days later. But the official history often stops at the edge of the water. It fails to tell us what happened to the minds of the men who came back and the unprecedented, cruel lengths a military bureaucracy will go to in order to protect its own reputation. Today, we are opening the sealed naval records, the court-martial transcripts, and the private correspondence to uncover a profound human tragedy that began in the Philippine Sea and ended decades later on a quiet front porch. Before we step into the freezing darkness of that July night, take a moment to subscribe and join us as we bring the forgotten shadows of history into the light, the secret and the shadow in the Pacific. In the midsummer of 1945, the USS Indianapolis was a vessel defined by its prestige and its secrets. Under the command of Captain McVeigh, a decorated and deeply respected officer, the heavy cruiser was entrusted with a mission so classified that neither he nor his crew knew exactly what they were carrying in the wooden crates secured below deck. They only knew it was the instrument that would end the war. They had successfully delivered the vital components for the atomic weapon to Tinian Island in record time. They had done their duty flawlessly, but glory is a fleeting thing in wartime. On the return voyage, sailing toward Leyte Gulf unescorted, the pride of the fleet was nothing more than a lonely silhouette against a vast, pitch-black ocean. It was just past midnight on July 30th. Below deck, hundreds of young men, some barely 18 years old, were sleeping in the sweltering heat, dreaming of home. They had no idea that beneath the surface, the Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto, had them perfectly framed in its periscope. At exactly 12:14 in the morning, 2 torpedoes slammed into the starboard side of the Indianapolis. The impact was cataclysmic. The first torpedo obliterated the bow, completely severing it from the rest of the ship. The second struck near the powder magazine and the aviation fuel tanks. A pillar of fire roared into the night sky, hundreds of feet high, illuminating a scene of absolute chaos. Deep inside the hull, the world turned into a maze of twisted steel, darkness, and rushing seawater. On the bridge, amidst the deafening roar of escaping steam and the frantic cries of his crew, Captain McVeigh realized immediately that the giant steel Leviathan was already gone. With the ship listing violently and sinking by the head, he issued the hardest order any commander can give: abandon ship. In just 12 terrifying minutes, the USS Indianapolis plunged beneath the surface, leaving over 800 men adrift in the black, freezing water. But we must pause exactly here to examine a reality that defies all logic. We are talking about the most powerful naval force the Earth had ever seen. The United States Navy in 1945 had a vast network of radar, thousands of ships, and meticulous tracking systems. Yet, a massive heavy cruiser with nearly 1,200 men aboard simply vanished from the map, and for days, not a single alarm was raised. No rescue ships were dispatched. No planes were sent to look for them. When you dive into the declassified routing logs and the command structure of the Pacific Fleet, you uncover a chilling truth about bureaucratic arrogance. Because the Indianapolis was on a top-secret mission, her movements were highly compartmentalized. The port authorities at Leyte Gulf knew she was scheduled to arrive, but under the rigid and deeply flawed directives of the time, the failure of a combat ship to arrive on schedule was not automatically assumed to be a distress situation. The radio operators on the sinking ship had desperately tapped out an SOS, and archives confirmed that 3 separate naval stations received the signal, yet one commander was asleep and ordered not to be disturbed. Another ignored it as a Japanese trick, and a third simply disregarded it. The system was completely fractured. The Navy was so confident in its control of the Pacific that the very concept of losing a heavy cruiser without warning was deemed impossible. And because of that arrogant assumption, hundreds of young boys were left floating in the vast, indifferent ocean, wearing only standard-issue life jackets, completely unaware that no one in the world was coming to save them. The sun would soon rise, and with it, their true nightmare would begin. The sun rose on July 31st, revealing a vast, unbroken horizon of empty blue. For the roughly 800 men who had survived the sinking, the light of day did not bring hope. It brought a terrifying realization of their profound isolation. They were scattered across miles of ocean, clustered in groups, clinging to debris, floater nets, and standard-issue life jackets that were only designed to keep a man afloat for 48 hours. The Philippine Sea is an unforgiving expanse. During the day, the equatorial sun beat down with relentless hostility, blistering their skin, cracking their lips, and swelling their eyes shut. At night, the temperature plummeted, plunging the exhausted men into severe hypothermia, their teeth chattering so violently it echoed across the dark, undulating water. But the elements were only the beginning of their torment. Beneath the surface, drawn by the vibrations of the sinking cruiser and the thrashing of hundreds of frantic men, the silent predators of the deep had already gathered. The oceanic white-tip sharks arrived in the shadows. At first, they targeted those who had already succumbed to the elements, but as the hours turned into days, the nature of the threat evolved into an unrelenting psychological terror. The true horror of this ordeal was the excruciating anticipation. It was the sudden, unseen disturbance in the water, feeling the violent tug on the boy floating right next to you, and watching him slip beneath the waves in absolute silence. It was the profound, paralyzing helplessness of dangling your legs in a bottomless abyss, waiting for a touch in the dark, knowing there was nowhere to run. By the third day, a new and far more insidious enemy emerged from within the men themselves, the agonizing, unquenchable thirst. Surrounded by millions of gallons of water, they were dying of dehydration, driven to the edge of human endurance by the heat and the constant salt spray. Some young sailors succumbed to the ultimate temptation and drank from the ocean. The salt water rapidly attacked their minds, leading to terrifying and vivid hallucinations. Exhausted men began to see phantom islands on the horizon. They believed the Indianapolis was suspended just beneath them, offering cold, fresh water from its drinking fountains. In their delirium, they broke away from the safety of the groups, swimming off into the vast emptiness, chasing mirages until they simply faded away into the expanse. Yet, in the midst of this unimaginable despair, the quiet nobility of the human spirit refused to be completely extinguished. We must look past the tragedy to see the unsung bravery of the men who refused to let their brothers go. Officers and chaplains moved tirelessly from group to group, offering prayers, holding the hands of terrified teenagers, and desperately trying to keep them awake. They knew that in this empire of thirst, closing your eyes often meant stepping onto a tragic and final path. They bound themselves together with ropes and belts, forming fragile human chains against the immensity of the Pacific, sharing a silent vow to endure just one more hour. But human endurance has a physical limit. As the fourth day dawned, the life jackets were becoming dangerously waterlogged, slowly pulling the weakened men downward. Hope had almost completely evaporated under the scorching sun. They were, in every measurable way, entirely abandoned by the world they had sworn to defend. On the fourth day, the nightmare broke, not by a coordinated naval rescue, but by pure, blind luck. Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn, flying a routine patrol in a Ventura bomber, was in the back of his aircraft, fixing a broken antenna when he glanced down at the vast, sunlit ocean. He expected to see empty waves. Instead, he saw a massive oil slick and hundreds of small, dark silhouettes scattered for miles. Those dots were the remnants of the USS Indianapolis. Ships were frantically dispatched to the coordinates. Out of nearly 1,200 men who had sailed into the Pacific, only 316 were pulled from the abyss. Their physical toll was severe, and their minds were forever altered by the shadows of the sea. But as the exhausted survivors were wrapped in blankets and placed in hospital beds, a different kind of darkness was gathering in Washington. The United States Navy had to answer a terrifying question from an outraged public and a hungry press. How could they have completely lost a heavy cruiser and abandoned its crew? The High Command quickly realized that the absolute truth, a catastrophic failure of their own communication and tracking protocols, was completely unacceptable. The institution instinctively moved to protect itself. To shield the bureaucracy, the system required a scapegoat. The cold gaze of military justice turned directly toward the man who had suffered alongside his crew, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh, who had watched his beloved ship go down, who had floated in the freezing waters and desperately tried to keep his young sailors alive, was formally charged. He was accused of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag, a defensive maneuver that experts already knew would have been practically useless against the high-speed advanced torpedoes of the Japanese fleet. In a devastating blow, McVeigh became the only captain in the entire history of the United States Navy to face a court-martial for losing a ship in wartime. But we must stop and examine the profound absurdity of what happened next in that courtroom. We often believe that military tribunals are built upon an unshakable foundation of honor and brotherhood. Yet, to ensure a conviction and clear its own name, the prosecution crossed a line that defied all precedent. The Navy summoned Mochitsura Hashimoto, the commander of the very Japanese submarine that had sunk the Indianapolis. They brought the enemy into the American courtroom to testify against an American hero. It was a surreal, deeply uncomfortable spectacle. Even Hashimoto, standing before the tribunal, stated clearly that zigzagging would have made absolutely no difference. He had the cruiser dead in his sights, regardless of its path. Yet, the machinery of bureaucracy is entirely deaf to truth when its own survival is at stake. Despite the clear evidence, despite the testimony of the enemy commander, and despite the overwhelming, fiercely loyal support of his surviving crew, Captain McVeigh was found guilty. His spotless career was effectively shattered. The Navy had successfully washed its hands of a colossal operational failure, shifting the immense, crushing weight of the tragedy squarely onto the shoulders of one man. But the gavel falling in that Washington courtroom was not the end of his punishment. It was merely the beginning of a relentless, decades-long sentence, one that would be served not in a prison cell, but in the quiet, agonizing solitude of his own home, waiting for the postman to arrive. In the years that followed the end of the war, the United States entered an era of unprecedented prosperity and celebration. The nation was busy building highways, expanding suburbs, and looking toward a bright, peaceful future. Ticker tape parades filled the streets, and soldiers returned to the open arms of their families. But for Charles Butler McVeigh, the war did not end on a battleship in Tokyo Bay. It simply relocated to the quiet, suffocating confines of his own living room. Though he had been allowed to quietly retire from the Navy as a rear admiral, a hollow promotion that felt more like a polite dismissal, the title offered absolutely no shield against the ghosts of the Philippine Sea, and those ghosts did not haunt him in the dark of night. They arrived in the broad daylight, delivered by the local postman. As the holidays approached each year, especially around Thanksgiving and Christmas, the letters would begin to pile up. They were written on delicate stationery, penned in the shaking handwriting of mothers, fathers, and young widows from every corner of the country. If you read the transcripts of this private correspondence today, the sheer weight of the grief is almost impossible to process. One letter, arriving perfectly timed for the holiday season, simply read, "Merry Christmas, Captain. We are spending another year staring at an empty chair at our dinner table. I hope you are enjoying yours. Knowing my boy is still at the bottom of the Pacific because of you. He never threw them away. He never hid them." The man who had faced the blistering sun, the freezing nights, and the unseen terrors beneath the waves now sat in his quiet home and read every single word. But we must look closely at the true nature of this relentless anger. The families writing these devastating letters were not malicious. They were simply drowning in a vast ocean of unanswered questions and profound sorrow. The United States Navy had deliberately obscured the catastrophic failures of its own tracking and communication networks. The institution had successfully hidden itself in the shadows of classified reports and bureaucratic red tape, leaving these grieving families with only one visible face to blame. The system protected the machine, while the man who had desperately tried to save their boys was left standing alone in the glaring, unforgiving light of public condemnation. For over 2 decades, McVeigh carried this immense, invisible burden. The physical wounds of the ocean had long since healed, but the psychological isolation was absolute. He became a prisoner of his own survival. The heavy cruiser that sank in 12 minutes had anchored itself permanently in his mind, pulling him a little further under with every passing year. The tragedy of leadership is that the responsibility never truly washes away, even when the uniform is folded and put in a box. By the time the winter of 1968 approached, the weight of those thousands of letters and the faces of the boys who never came home had finally become too heavy for one man to carry any further. By November of 1968, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III was 70 years old. He lived in a quiet house in Litchfield, Connecticut, surrounded by the fading autumn leaves and the crisp chill of the approaching winter. To the outside world, he was a distinguished veteran living out his twilight years in peaceful retirement. But inside the walls of his home, the Philippine Sea was still raging. The relentless tide of letters from grieving families thus had never stopped washing ashore. On a cold afternoon, stepping out onto his back porch, the man who had survived the most devastating naval disaster in American history finally reached the absolute limit of human endurance. The institutional betrayal, the loss of his men, and the crushing, misplaced hatred of a mourning nation had worn down a spirit that the freezing ocean could not break. Facing the quiet woods, Captain McVeigh made the ultimate dark sacrifice. He took a tragic and final path, choosing to slip away into the shadows rather than face another day carrying the unbearable ghosts of the Pacific. When he was found, a profound and heartbreaking detail emerged, one that captures the entire tragedy of his existence. Clutched tightly in his right hand was a small, worn toy sailor. It was a good luck charm he had received as a boy, a quiet talisman he had kept throughout his entire life. Even in his final moments, stepping into the absolute unknown, Charles McVeigh never abandoned his men. He carried them with him to the very end. It would take more than 3 decades after his tragic departure for the truth to finally break through the armored walls of the naval bureaucracy, thanks to the relentless, unwavering efforts of his surviving crew, men who never stopped calling him their captain, and a nationwide campaign sparked by a young student's history project. The locked archives were finally opened. The classified logs, the ignored distress signals, and the deeply flawed testimony of the Japanese commander were laid bare for the world to see. In the year 2000, the United States Congress and the President signed a resolution officially exonerating Captain McVeigh, stating unequivocally that the loss of the USS Indianapolis was not his fault. His record was cleared. The dark cloud over his name was officially lifted. But a piece of paper, signed in Washington, cannot reach back through time. It cannot silence the agonizing echoes of the letters, and it cannot undo the decades of psychological torment inflicted upon a loyal commander who was sacrificed to protect the reputation of a rigid machine. The official history books will forever state that a Japanese torpedo sank the heavy cruiser on that dark July night. But the unwritten, deeply melancholic truth of the USS Indianapolis is that the ocean only took the ship. It was the system that took the man. If you believe that the true cost of history lies not in the numbers, but in the human souls left behind in the shadows, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know which forgotten story we should uncover next. Help us ensure that men like Captain McVeigh and his crew are never erased by the passage of time. Until next time, keep looking beyond the official records.